Welcome back to the Bioactive Podcast. This is going to be a nerdy episode. Today's episode is all about water and weed, and it might be the most interesting to cultivators and lab scientists out there. But honestly, this information is really important for anybody to understand the shelf stability of products better, from your salami to your crackers to your weed. So we're going to be discussing in excruciating detail the difference between water activity and moisture content in cannabis. And today I have with me Jini Glaros, who is the CSO, or the Chief Scientific Officer at Modern Canna. She recently finished some experiments where she's learning how moisture content and water activity are related to each other and how reliable the different laboratory measurements are for these different values. Oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, but they are very different. So for some more background, water activity is expressed from a scale from 0 to 1, 0 being bone dry and 1 being pure water. Water activity can be used to determine the availability of water for microbial growth, so things like bacteria and fungi. So microorganisms have a critical threshold where they can't grow if something's really dry, and that value is below 0.6. So this is why most state regulations are set so that the water activity of your cannabis products have to be below 0.65 to make sure that they're stable on a shelf. Moisture content, on the other hand, measures the amount of water that can be easily removed from a material. Moisture content doesn't take into account the availability of water for microbial growth, so it sometimes is inefficient for measuring things like quality, which we touched upon in the science of smokability experiments. If you remember, phase 1 had to do with the different water activities of 0.45, 0.65, and 0.85. But we did not send out the 0.85 to people because we were worried about fungal growth. And we are going to touch upon how to take these measurements as home growers as well. But before we get started on this episode, one last reminder on what decarboxylation means, because it's a big word and we do mention it a few times in this episode. So if you remember, the cannabis plant is producing all the different cannabinoids in the acidic form. So all of the molecules contain an acid group called a carboxylic acid. And these molecules in the acidic form aren't super active in our body. So over time, we've learned that you have to activate or heat up the cannabinoids in order to release that CO2 group and turn the cannabinoids from the acidic form into the form we know and love, like regular THC, CBD, CBG, etc. And this process of heating up cannabis to lose that carboxylic acid group is called decarboxylation. And this is really important in the laboratory because that CO2 group actually weighs something, and we need to take that into account when we're doing the calculations for lab analysis. All right, I feel like this was already a whole podcast episode, but grab a drink, stretch your legs, relax your jaw, and just chill with Jini and I for the next hour or so. All right, so welcome back to the Bioactive Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Riley Kirk, and I am here with Jini Glaros, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at Modern Canna. And Jini, I'm going to let you kind of give more of a background on how you got to this position. I don't know if it was a linear path, non-linear path, but if you wouldn't mind just giving a little background on how you got to where you are today at Modern Canna, that'd be great.
Thanks. So super excited to be here today. So a little bit about my history and past. I really started out as an environmental chemist. That's kind of the route that I thought I was going to go when I originally started in undergrad, then decided I wanted to obtain an MD PhD. Life happens, that doesn't work out. But in some gap years that I took, I got some awesome experience. One, working at the National Institute of Aging, which is a portion of the National Institutes of Health. And I worked under Dr. Wilhelm Bohr, which is Neil Bohr's grandson, which was a really cool experience.
Wow.
And then after that, worked at UF in their College of Medicine for a little over a year and a half. From that point, I ended up moving back home for some personal reasons and actually found a cannabis lab that was just getting started. And it ended up being a perfect fit. If you had asked me 10 years ago if this is what I would have been doing, I would have told you you were crazy. But I really can't imagine myself being anywhere else but cannabis. So I love what I do. I have a passion for it, and it led me to obtaining my master's. So I have my master's in medical cannabis science and therapeutics from the University of Maryland. So I was part of their second graduating class. So I was really
Wow.
excited to attend that program and be able to learn a lot more about the therapeutic side. So being in a lab, I knew a lot about the analytical. I had a really good understanding of all of the testing and, analytically how what needed to be done with cannabis. But therapeutic wise, I was in the dark. And so it really was brought everything full circle for me to be able to spend time saying, okay, here is your patient, and these are what your patient wants to use cannabis for. These are the different ailments or the different diseases they may want to use to treat cannabis. And here's all of their other underlying issues. Can they treat with cannabis? And if so, what would you recommend? And so that was a really cool experience for me to be able to tie everything together that I had learned in analytical chemistry and then add that therapeutics background.
Oh, it's so important to have that therapeutics background, especially as you're coming face to face with consumers and understanding why they care so much about testing and, why they care so much about the quality of the medicine. And if you don't mind answering, are you a cannabis consumer yourself? You don't have to answer if you're not comfortable.
Not really, no. Which is it's an interesting, right? It's another interesting side to me is I'm not a cannabis consumer, but I am still so passionate about cannabis. And sometimes I don't think that you often find that. I think a lot of the people who are super passionate are users, and that's not who I am, but that doesn't mean that I'm not crazy passionate about cannabis and want to learn as much as I can about the plant.
No, I love that. And especially with your background, kind of having a really diverse knowledge set, whether it's with the aging research or with the consumers or with its analytical chemistry, whatever it is, cannabis is integrated into everything. Like there's research on cannabis and aging. There's research on the environmental impacts of cannabis. It is so broad, and you really find that it is weaved through every component of our life. It's not just like, oh, there's the cannabis industry over there and they're doing their thing and, everyone else is doing their thing. So I think having that really diverse background is awesome. And I think it's awesome that there's people that are super passionate about this plant in the industry who aren't smoking every day or aren't consuming every day, but still see the value of this medicine. It's so important to have people on consumer and non-consumer sides.
And I think that's where, a lot of my passion came from. My grandfather passed away from bone cancer back in 2018, and this was something we wanted him to try. And he was very old-fashioned, a very, old-fashioned Southern man who was not all about it. And I was pushing for it, and I was pushing for it hard. And I wished he would have accepted that. But it's really great to see other family members and other friends who, now that I'm in the industry and have insight and can provide this feedback, who are willing to change their mindset and are willing to use cannabis medicinally, and to see the impact it has on their lives is just so rewarding that even if I'm not using, I can persuade people who need it medicinally to use it and then see the benefit of them using it. I love it. It's great.
And honestly, it's almost, in a lot of cases, probably more valuable because you're kind of this non-biased perspective. Like when people ask me about cannabis, they're not looking for a non-biased perspective. Like I am clearly biased. I'm a daily consumer. I'm working in this industry. And, I think this is the perfect medicine. But at the same time, when people want more of a nuanced view or want one that's a little less biased, maybe they wouldn't come to me because I am going to more often than not suggest cannabis. So I think it's really cool, and I wish your grandpa would have been open to that. And I think that's the case for a lot of palliative care, that we wish that stigma hadn't reached such a large portion of people, because it could have made those last few months or even years peaceful and able to communicate and happy or happier, but we're moving towards there. Science is reversing the stigma, or at least I hope it is, and you're definitely part of that. So I definitely want to talk about some of the research that you're doing at Modern Canna, because one, it's sick that you're doing research, not just research, but research that is applicable to the industry, and there's such a need for this. So I heard Jini talk the first time at the Cannabis Science Conference in Kansas City. Kansas City has some of the worst weed I've ever smoked ever. But that's not part of this conversation. But anyway, so I heard you talk at that conference for the first time, and my jaw was just like open. I was like, I knew that there's a difference between water activity and moisture content, but I've never had somebody explain it like you explained it. That makes it like, oh, you need to care about these numbers, because if they're reported wrong, you could test higher for contaminants like heavy metals. You could have your actual percent THC incorrect. And it's really important to get these standardized and consistent numbers in the testing labs. So I would love for you to kind of walk us through why you started this experiment and what that process was like. And then we can, keep talking. But there's so many different methods you talked about, so many calculations, and what was the goal and what made you realize that this was such an issue in the industry?
So really, it has been moisture, and understanding the proper moisture content in cannabis is the hill that I will die on. So it is where I started from the beginning. So when we came into this and we were looking at methods for our laboratory to run moisture content, everybody was pretty much running loss on drying. You put the sample in an oven, you heat it to 103 degrees or sometimes higher. We see labs, using a moisture balance that heats up to 150. And you put your sample on it and it dries to a consistent weight. And then you say, okay, this was the amount that was lost, and that's my moisture content. Well, immediately, in knowing what I knew about cannabis coming in and all of the volatiles and semi-volatile compounds like your cannabinoids and your terpenes, which if you heat them up, different things happen to them. So your cannabinoids are going to decarboxylate, your terpenes are going to just go bye-bye completely.
You're literally vaping it. Like that method is vaping the flower. So you're
It
evaporating.
was alarming to me. And it was like, wait, why are we doing this? So coming from that environmental background, we had some experience with fertilizer and testing fertilizer. And when testing fertilizer, you can't put fertilizer in an oven. Well, actually, you can put it in an oven, but you'll put it in an oven once and only once, because your door will blow off of your oven because fertilizer is combustible. So in the environmental world, to test fertilizer, the methods involve you putting the sample in a vacuum desiccator, and you pull off all of the water through vacuum desiccation because of the volatility of the fertilizer. So I said, wait, why can't we do this for cannabis? Like, this makes more sense. And so that's really where all of this was born from, as I started with that vacuum desiccation method. And we were getting substantially lower numbers than what every other lab was reporting. So when other labs were reporting, 14% moisture, we were reporting 4% moisture. And it's like, wait, where is this discrepancy? And why is it so different?
And before we continue, can you just describe what a normal range of moisture in a sample would be? Like you said 14, is that normal? Is there a range that you're typically looking at there?
So when we're talking about dried cured cannabis flower, what the industry is typically defined as, the ideal range is between 10 and 14% moisture. Okay. And while that is great, and that's what we've been taught, it's inaccurate. And so actual moisture content in dried cured cannabis flower is closer to 5 to 9%. And we've proved this with our study. So we've proved that everything has been skewed, and the industry believes this based on the standard method that was used. And what became the gold standard for the industry wasn't accurately quantifying water.
Because it was also quantifying those other volatiles. So that number was higher because you were also counting in these terpenes and cannabinoids and other things that were adding to that weight of amount that was lost. So it was not accurate for actual moisture or water.
Exactly. And so you were adding all of these different things in. And when you talk about, a good flower sample that's high THC, if we're talking about 20 to 25% THCA, when you decarboxylate that, that's anywhere from about 2 to 4% by weight loss when that decarboxylation happens. And then, good flower, 3 to 5% terpenes. If you lose all of those terpenes, that's another 3 to 5% by weight. So when we talk about dried cured cannabis flower, it is probably 6 to 8% volatiles or semi-volatile compounds. So that's where that additional weight is coming in between that 10 and 14% and that 5 and 9%.
Gotcha. Okay, so the method that everyone's been using is not accurately quantifying the amount of water in a sample. But so vacuum desiccation, you might have just explained that, but I know you said for combustible samples, but like what is the desiccation part of that? Like what is happening in vacuum desiccation?
So with vacuum desiccation in that method, you're keeping a sample at room temperature and you're using a vacuum pump and then a desiccant to help absorb some of that additional water, and you're removing the water from the sample that way. And so that was one of the techniques that we wanted to use and to see how that impacted our results. We were getting such drastically low numbers, though, that we did have some concerns that that vacuum desiccation method wasn't pulling off some of the bound water, which is why we wanted to dive into an experiment that would allow us to compare 5 different techniques. And we wanted to say, okay, here's 5 techniques that you can use to measure moisture. Which of these is the most accurate? And the way that we were able to determine that is by also looking at the cannabinoid and terpene content pre and post drying. So we would run moisture and then run cannabinoids and terpenes to understand what loss was occurring with each of those methods so that we could say, okay, these are the most accurate methods for measuring moisture in cannabis, and this is what will allow lab A, B, C, D, producer, D, E, F, G, to get the same result or to get results within an acceptable, reproducible range. Because this not only impacts the labs who are doing the testing, but it also impacts the cultivators, because cultivators are drying to a specific percentage. And they're a lot of times using a moisture meter or some other type of device that has a lot of times been developed through an isotherm of collecting, standard data. And so it reads it quickly, or it does heat the sample and dry it. And so in doing that, those methods, if they're not accurately measuring moisture, producers may not be drying their flower correctly, and their flower may be way too moist or way too dry, and they may not realize it. And so you have different issues with both of those things, right? Way too moist, you're going to have microbial growth and you're going to have a high water activity. Way too dry, you're not going to have good smokability. And that's a lot of the research you've done in looking at the smokability of flowers. So I think it's really cool to tie it all in and say, okay, wait, this doesn't just impact the labs. And I think sometimes people forget that. They see the research and they're like, okay, well, this doesn't matter because, I'm not a testing lab. And it's like, no, it does matter because you're producing this flower.
Something you talked about at the conference we were at, and I'm hoping maybe we can cover this at the end, but like it does affect the numbers you're putting on a label too, which, often we say don't pay just attention to the THC percentage, but a lot of people do, and it does affect the way you can market and sell and distribute your product. So again, back to the cultivators, the manufacturers, the producers, like this information is vital, and like it impacts not just like the smokability, but the weight of that final product, the aroma, how much the aroma can come through, so all of it's so important from cultivator to consumer. So I love that you put that in perspective. Can we dive into some of the other methods? You talked about the desiccation. You talked about the traditional method. What are some other ways that people are testing this?
So the other 3 methods that we looked at, in addition to the traditional loss on drying and the vacuum desiccation, is going to be a vacuum oven method, which is going to be very similar to a vacuum desiccation method, but it's going to add a little bit of heat. And so this actually comes from the European pharmacopoeia method for how to dry cannabis to test it. So drying, testing it analytically, how you would dry it is you would put it in a vacuum oven that also contains a desiccant, and that would be done at 40 degrees Celsius for 24 hours. And so this would allow a slower drying and add a little bit of heat so that, theoretically you shouldn't have a whole lot of terpene loss and you shouldn't have a whole lot of decarboxylation occur. And we were able to prove that that was the case. We did see more terpene loss than we did with some of the other techniques, but that's because it's being left for 24 hours and it's under vacuum. So you're pulling off more of those terpenes, but it didn't experience complete terpene loss, which I think is an important part of that. The next technique was Carl Fisher, which is, the gold standard for measuring moisture content in all other industries. So when we talk about looking at moisture in, different agricultural products, we're using Carl Fisher. So in those commodities, that's how they're measuring it, because Carl Fisher is nice that it doesn't include anything else. It's all reaction based. So when you have these volatile or semi-volatile compounds that may be lost, the Carl Fisher reaction is not going to count that in. It's going to separate that out. So you could have decarboxylation and you could have terpene loss, but you shouldn't see an increase in the moisture number that's obtained by that method, which is what our study was able to reveal.
Whoa, cool. So that's based on a chemical reaction with water. So it's going to be super, super specific to giving you a number that relates to the water that's in that sample. So you can't misquantify these other things like terpenes or cannabinoids as part of that sample.
Exactly. It has to be that reaction. It's a titration reaction with water. So
okay, cool.
If you don't, if you have terpenes or cannabinoids, as long as they're not breaking down into water, they're not going to be counted in this reaction when it occurs.
Cool.
And then the final method is loss on drying, but at a low temperature. So we know that cannabinoids start to decarboxylate at about 85 degrees Celsius. So we went with 80 degrees here. And so we were able to keep them at a low temperature, prevent decarboxylation, and then we were able to use a small enough sample amount that the drying happened quick enough that it limited the amount of terpene loss. So that was really a lot of this too, was method development and figuring out what worked and validating those methods to make sure that they weren't leading to any other weird results. They were bringing things to complete dryness. And it was, if you leave it a little longer, you go farther, you dry more, you lose different things. So it was a lot of trial and error before we got the study fully up and running. But once we did, we took all 5 of those methods and we ran 120 samples of dried cured cannabis flower, different product types. So we're talking whole flower, we're talking ground flower, we're talking pre-rolls, we're talking trim. Dried cured was sent to us from producers and ran them in tandem. So we ran 9 samples a day, 8 samples and a duplicate across those 5 techniques. That way there was no discrepancy of, oh, you ran Carl Fisher on day 1, but you ran loss on drying on day 12.
Right. The relative humidity in the air was different and everything. Yeah, totally. That is so much work. That is so much work for that many samples on 5 different methods. Just labeling test tubes, like that is so much work for you. So shout
out to my amazing intern because
okay, shout out. What is the intern's name?
Dominica. She was fantastic, amazing. Without her, would not have made that happen.
Yeah, you're amazing. Like I'm just picturing like that level of organization and mad respect over there. That's awesome. So what were the main findings? Like, is it a crazy discrepancy between these 5 methods of what the different results might be, or like what was the variation?
So between the lowest and the highest, yes. So vacuum desiccation revealed the lowest result. And I think the average moisture content that we saw, let me actually pull that number up for you so I can give everybody
that'd be awesome.
Actual number for that. So across the 120 samples, we saw a average moisture content for dried cured cannabis flower using vacuum desiccation of about 4.1%. So 4.1% for there. And then to the loss on drying high temperature, which yielded way higher than the rest of the techniques, we saw an average moisture content of about 12.5%. So we're talking about a 11% difference between those two.
That's a lot. Yeah.
So that's a big discrepancy between those 2 different techniques. But interestingly and really actually exciting is that across those 120 samples, the other 3 techniques yielded results on average that were within 0.5% of each other. So,
whoa, that's tight. That's awesome.
So loss on drying gave about 7.45. Vacuum oven gave about 7.7 and Carl Fisher gave about 7.3. So
wow,
really
that's really cool. What are the like price differences if a lab wants to do one of these 3? Are they like vastly different where, to use one method, they'd have to invest $100,000 and then another one costs $5,000? Like, is it obvious of what a lab should choose when they're figuring out what to do?
There is one technique that is definitely going to be more expensive. It's going to be the Carl Fisher. It's going to require different equipment. It's going to require more consumables. So it is, it's the gold standard for a reason. It is high, it's a high technology technique. It is very accurate. It is very thorough, but it is very expensive. And so I think having it as an option for labs, especially labs if they're wanting to do research, is great, but also having these other options that are a little bit more affordable. So if you're a startup lab or if you're a cultivator, you can take these two other methods and you can get them going in your cultivation facility for a relatively cheap cost. And then you can train, an entry-level technician who works in your grow to run these methods. They're not difficult to run. And so I think the applicability of these different techniques across the industry is great. And then it also allows some variety, right? There's always the talk of when we say, oh, there's only one standard method that can be done, you're kind of tying people's hands to innovation and you're not allowing them to innovate. And so by doing this, we're saying, wait, we're not tying people's hands. We're suggesting 3 different techniques that can be used that can all obtain similar results.
Oh, I love that. And one of the questions I actually got on Patreon, I think you kind of just covered. It was from Howling Buds, and they asked, the biggest question I have is how to translate this research into small-scale home growers without expensive equipment to measure the results. And if you were a home grower and had to choose one method that was easy and cheap, what would that one method be?
Probably that loss on drying low temperature, because you can get a cheap, affordable, like small standalone oven, set it to 80 degrees, monitor the temperature, weigh the right amount of sample. So in this, we validated weighing anywhere between 0.5 and 1 gram of sample. So it also wouldn't require them to use a large amount of sample, which is great for a home grower. And they could dry that sample for, bring it to dryness. They would need to figure out, exactly what that timing would be. So there would be a little bit of validation in that, but that's something, I would be happy to talk with someone about and explain, like, here's how you, test it. And you just have a scale and you take your sample and you weigh it before and then you weigh it after. And then you can calculate that loss that occurs to determine that moisture content.
Cool. So in the research that you put out or that you're doing, are you also sharing those calculations so that people who read your research can say, okay, cool, I'm going to do this myself and I want to test it, but I want to get the same quality of results that you're getting? Are you sharing from start to finish? How do you do that?
Yes. So I'm actually in the process of writing the publication now for peer review. So it's a doozy. There's a lot of methods and materials section that is going to be explaining some of the different things we did and talk about validation and talk about, the impact of weighing more sample, because with something like loss on drying low temperature, the more sample you weigh, you could start to skew your result, because to bring it to a steady weight, it's going to have to stay for longer. And the longer you leave that sample, because you are applying heat, the more cannabinoid or the more terpenes you're going to lose. And then eventually you are going to start to decarboxylate your cannabinoids. So if you were to weigh 5 grams of sample into a dish where your surface area wasn't evenly distributed, you're going to start to see that decarboxylation occur, because to dry all the way through, the stuff on the outside is going to start to decarboxylate. And so we're definitely going to include a lot about the method validation and about how the math works of, like, here's your initial weight, here's your final weight, here's how you calculate your moisture content based on that, because I think it's important for people to be able to reproduce this internally or in their lab or in their cultivation facility or even in their home grow. And without those calculations, it's going to be difficult to do.
No, I love that. And I really think you're doing your due diligence and getting this information out there, which I give you complete accolades for. That's awesome, because there's so much research that you read it and you're like, that is so cool, I want to implement that. And then you're missing that puzzle piece, like either in the publication or the white paper, like whatever it is, you're like missing the applicable piece of, like, how do I take this research and make it applicable to my own? So I think that's really cool that you're including that. Would you mind talking a little more about decarboxylation and why it's such an important metric to be measuring for moisture content, water activity? Because, I don't want to give any hints away, but why is that so important?
So the decarboxylation is what occurs when you go from THCA to THC. So it's the loss of that carboxyl group. And so with that, we know that conversion is when you go from THCA to THC, it's about 0.877. So you have to think of that in percentage. We're talking about 13% loss there. So it's important to understand, because when you have something that is that 20 to 25% THCA and you convert that, if you heat it up and you convert it all to THC, you lost all of that carboxyl group from that sample, which means you lost 13% of what you had there.
Like weight, you're losing physical weight, similar to losing terpenes, like you're losing the weight of the terpenes and cannabinoids. When you lose that CO2, when you're decarboxylating, that weighs something, which is silly to think about, but like it really does weigh something. And when you think of like the weight of molecules, when you hold a solvent that's really heavy, like dichloromethane or something like that, it's heavy because the molecules are heavy. And I think that's like such a funny thing to think about, because we always just think like liquid weighs heavy, it's heavy, but like if you're holding a heavier molecule, it is going to weigh heavier. So even in the sense of just looking at THCA and losing that little CO2, when you have enough of those molecules together and enough of those CO2 are leaving to the environment, that's going to come through as an actual loss of weight.
Yes, and an impactful loss of weight. We're not, especially when we're talking about high THC products, not hemp products, but high THC products. It's somewhere between 2 and 4% total weight that's lost, depending on how high the THC is in that product. And that's a lot. You're losing 2 to 4% by weight. That's a big impact.
That's a lot
on that product. So I think it's important to remember that and to understand the impact of that. And also when we're talking about, measuring THC in a product, for example, and doing something like a dry weight correction. So if you have a higher moisture content, you're going to get a higher dry weight correction factor. The higher the dry weight correction factor, the higher the concentration of the product. So if you have something that's 20% THCA and you have a moisture that's 14%, that's going to raise that number by about 1.14. So you're going to take the 20 times about 1.14. Mm-hmm. So it's going to increase that THC. Well, if that's not the true moisture content in that product, then that's impacting what is actually there. Also, are we better to just report as received, because that's what the consumer is getting? So
not correcting for, right. Okay.
For something like THC and terpenes, are we better to not dry weight correct? Because the consumer is not drying out their product anymore. I guarantee you that. If anything, they're sitting their product out in the humidity and letting it absorb a little bit more moisture if they feel it's too dry. So they're as received, what the lab receives it as and tests the THC out as, is what the consumer is getting. So do we even need to be applying dry weight correction to something like THC? But then the caveat to that also is how does that apply to contaminants, right? Because contaminants are a different story, because when you combust your cannabis and you're using it, the contaminants do not behave the same way as your cannabinoids. And so you're really just concentrating them down. And so it is important to know that moisture content for the contaminants. But if you're over-reporting moisture, you're over-reporting contaminants if you're dry weight correcting. If you're under-reporting moisture, you're under-reporting contaminants. So we need to get the moisture correct to get the contaminant concentration correct.
Oh, this makes so much sense. And I think I was either in your last talk or maybe it was like a YouTube video, you're talking about, I think, arsenic as an example here, and how with one moisture level it could pass, but if it was just like 1 or 2% higher, that same sample could fail. And that's, that's pretty impactful. Is it currently standardized, or is it currently like the gold standard to dry weight correct, or is that up to the lab or up to the manufacturer? Like, who's deciding that, and how standardized is it?
So the state regulations are what is deciding the dry weight correction and what is dry weight corrected versus what may not be dry weight corrected. When we look at every other industry, it is standard to dry weight correct. So when you look at contaminants especially, so in the environmental world, if you're testing soil, you have to dry weight correct for that, the moisture in that soil, because the moisture content is not always going to be the same in the soil. If you're experiencing a drought, the moisture content is going to be much lower. If you're experiencing rainy season, it's going to be much higher. It may make the contaminants look diluted. It may make them look more concentrated. So everything is always reported on a dry weight. But we see a lot right now in the cannabis industry of discrepancy between this and a lot of confusion about what needs to be reported on a dry weight basis and what doesn't. And it's ultimately because it's the regulator's decision. So I know in Florida specifically, we aren't allowed to dry weight correct flower anymore. It has to be reported as received when it comes to the THC content. Okay. Terpenes are not in Florida statute, so they don't regulate what anyone does.
So they don't exist. Okay.
And then with contaminants, there's a little bit of gray area about what needs to happen with dry weight correcting contaminants. But I believe that the state is planning on clearing that up in final rules. So labs are still operating under emergency rules. So they are hoping in those final rules to make that a lot more clear, where it's not a gray area of, no, you dry weight correct your contaminants and you do not dry weight correct your cannabinoids, because we want the consumer to know what they're actually receiving, and what they're actually receiving is the as received tested THC, because the moisture is that amount.
Right. And that, I guess that does make sense for just transparency to the consumer and like predictability. When this might have been a couple years ago, 2-3 years ago, but I remember when I was first learning about this dry weight correcting and the dry and cure process and why so much legal cannabis was so bone dry, is somebody told me that people were drying the cannabis as much as they possibly could because it would spike up the amount of THC per weight of sample. So, they attributed this why so much of the legal herb that you buy was, you could look at it wrong and it would, it just is so dry. Whereas if you bought cannabis from maybe your friend who grows in Vermont or Maine or, wherever, that was much higher water activity, moisture. It was easier to roll. It had better smokability. It had better flavor. And I think we've seen it kind of switch a little better where the legal herb is better, but I do think that this might still be a problem of like over drying in the industry. I still get a lot of legal cannabis that I'm pretty disappointed in the dry cure and like just how difficult it is to roll, and it's just like it's really not a pleasant herbal experience.
And I think some of the regulations impact that too, right? The state regulations, especially something like total yeast and mold, because people are battling these total yeast and mold reg limits. And the drier you get the flower, the less the possibility that you have total yeast and mold. And so some people may be over drying their flower to prevent failures of something like this, where a total yeast and mold test, and this is my personal opinion, not the opinion of my company, but I personally believe that total yeast and mold tests are not really an accurate test to be measuring, because we're looking at good yeasts and molds. We're looking at everything. We're not just looking at the pathogenic, like harmful species. And so that's just my little soapbox about total.
I like that. I like that perspective, especially, I was just talking to Morgan Boyle, who also works in a testing lab. And, she had a very similar perspective, and we had a conversation about outdoor cannabis too. And it's like, the outdoor market is already struggling so much because, the nugs aren't as sparkly, but they smoke so much better and they feel so much better. But they are constantly battling this total yeast and mold because it's an agricultural product that you're expecting to be sterile. Like, what are we doing?
Exactly. So it's a little bit of a battle, right? And I think that it leads to some of these issues that we see with the smokability of product. So, my opinion is that we're better to look for pathogenic species. So looking for the things like the Aspergillus, the Salmonella, the Stec, maybe even adding in some of the Penicillium species or Fusarium species that we know, could be harmful, and looking at those rather than measuring this total yeast and mold number that is, I don't personally believe, useful. Like, yes, it can be useful for a cultivator or producer to know about the sterility of their processes and from a processing standpoint of the cleanliness. But
I like that.
How is it going to impact the consumer? Because they may be using good yeast and molds instead of using pesticides. And if we're failing products for total yeast and mold, then we may be failing products that, and forcing people to use pesticides instead of using good yeast and molds to mitigate pest problems. So it's a double-edged sword, I think, measuring total yeast and mold. I get it that, a really high microbial load can be dangerous for some immunocompromised patients, but at the same time, for the standard user who may not be immunocompromised. And I think that's where patient education comes in. Like, look at the product before you buy it. Like, yes, let's run total yeast and mold so that people have that information, but let's not fail products on it based on it.
Right. And like, let's not get to the point of essentially requiring irradiation to get any product to pass in the legal market. That's silly. But I agree. There should be options. There should be thresholds. There should be options for medical patients and more adult use consumers. Now that we've talked about moisture, we'll say water for a while, would you mind discussing the difference between bound and unbound water in a cannabis sample, and what language we use to describe this and how it relates to like the safety of a product?
Yeah, definitely. So when we talk about bound versus unbound water, so bound and unbound water, looking at both together, is going to be your water content. It's going to be your total water in the sample, which is going to therefore translate into your moisture content. So my ideal definition for something like moisture would be the total amount of water present in a sample expressed as a percentage. So that would be your moisture content, the total water. That would be your bound and unbound water, versus your unbound water, your free water, would be your water activity. And so your free water, when we talk about water activity, there's a really complicated definition that talks about, the vapor pressure in the sample as relation to the vapor pressure of the air. And it's a whole complicated thing, but ultimately it's just free water in the sample. So those unbound water molecules. And water activity is so important from a safety standpoint because the higher the water activity, the higher probability of microbial growth. And so that's where we are measuring water activity more from a safety standard and moisture from more of a quality standard. And so I think that is another important thing to remember is, moisture does have some impact safety wise when it comes to like contaminant quantification. But when we're talking about the safety measurement that we're taking in cannabis, it needs to be that unbound free water. It needs to be that water activity.
So that unbound water is essentially what is available for a microbe or a little bacteria or fungi that's in a sample that needs that water to survive. And if it's unbound, it's available for those little microbes to use. But when we say it's bound, are we saying it's bound to another molecule in the sample? Is that what bound water is?
Yes.
Okay, so then it's not available to the microbe, so it's kind of stabilized. So we don't really need to put that into account when we're considering microbial growth or shelf life.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, and that's where the discrepancy comes. I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between moisture and water activity, or even the relationship between moisture and water activity, which is where the next study was born from what we did from moisture. So after we kind of figured out moisture and the best way to measure moisture, we really wanted to understand that relationship between the two, because if you can understand that relationship, there's even a possibility to use a water activity measurement, which is much simpler for a large scale cultivator to do. You can buy an instrument that you can stick a little bit of sample in. It's non-destructive and it will tell you what the water activity of that sample is. So if you can determine that relationship and the correlation between water activity and moisture, they never even have to measure moisture. They can say, here's my water activity, therefore here is my moisture in my product.
Oh, so this is your next project, is like figuring out the equation for this so that people can use one machine and inference a whole nother thing from it?
Yes, which is what we did. So
you already did it. Okay, cool. Yay. How'd it go?
It went awesome. So we were able to build the isotherm. Now, let me say, doing this in Florida was a battle, right?
I forgot you're in Florida. Yeah. Isn't like the average humidity like 90% in Florida? You're just like swimming on your day to day. That's wild.
So we had to wait till winter to do this. So we did this last winter, and we had like 7 dehumidifiers in one room and just had the doors sealed and shut at all times. And we're constantly having to empty these dehumidifiers to keep the moisture low. But we ultimately equilibrated different cannabis cultivars and different product types, so whole flower, ground flower, and pre-roll, two specific water activities. So salts have specific water activities when in a saturated solution. So for example, sodium chloride in a saturated solution has a known water activity of about 0.75. So
cool.
What you can do is you can make these little chambers, and you can put your cannabis flower in these chambers with saturated salt solutions. And what will happen is the airflow will allow that cannabis flower to obtain that specific water activity. So you can cannabis be a specific water activity.
Wait a second. Isn't this what the Bovida packs are? Like, isn't that like a saline solution that adds a specific water?
Yes. And so you can create your own sample at a specific water activity. So you can create a calibration. And so what we were able to do was we were able to equilibrate cannabis flower down from about 0.24 all the way up to about 0.78. And we were able to equilibrate it to all of those water activities. And now we can develop a curve. And then once you have them equilibrated to those specific water activities, measure the water activity, obtain what that value is. It's a non-destructive analysis, and then take those samples and run moisture on them via those three techniques that we show all provide identical or similar values within about 0.5% of each other. And then you can develop a calibration curve that shows the correlation between water activity and moisture.
Wow. So that's the big game changer, because these terms are used kind of interchangeably all the time, but like nobody really knew how they related to each other. So you're now creating a method to measure just one thing, but get both numbers so that there's no questioning anymore. You have both values.
Exactly. So Aqualab, Adium, they used to be Aqualab, now they're Adium by Aqualab. They have an instrument, it's called the TDL2. And so it's a water activity meter that uses a thermal diode laser to measure the water activity. So for products like derivative products that have solvents, it's not going to be impacted by solvents. And so they are who approached us after they saw a lot of our moisture research and were like, will you help us do a third-party validation on the curve we've established internally? And so we worked with them. We have one of their instruments in-house, and then we ran water activity on that instrument, and then we got their reported moisture, but we also then took the different moisture techniques we had already validated internally and ran it. And we were actually able to update their isotherm. So people who have those instruments, if they haven't already, should be receiving updates to their isotherm that will be the data that we were able to develop and validate as a third party, saying, yes, this works. And then wait, here's some small adjustments that we need to make based on three primary techniques that were used to measure moisture.
Wow, that's so rad. You were part of a update, a data update. That's like really cool. So all of this is in the publication you're writing, like both of or are these two separate pubs, or like what's your plan there?
Two separate publications.
Okay, cool.
So if I try to put it all in one publication, I think no one would ever finish reading
Published in 2028. Yeah.
So we're starting with the moisture, and then for the water activity and moisture relationship, we're doing a third-party validation document to start for Adium. And then once that's completed, then we'll work on a peer-reviewed publication for it, explaining the full technique and how it was done. So it's really exciting because, now we can say that, the standard water activity that you typically see for flower is going to be anywhere from, on the low end 0.45, which would be pretty dry, up to about 0.6 is what you're typically seeing, because the regulatory limit for most flower is 0.65. So based on that, and based on the calibration that we were able to develop, we were able to verify that dried cured cannabis flower should fall between 5 and 9%, which is ultimately what our other study showed as well. So it just further validated the study.
Okay, so the between 5 and 9% kind of equals the 0.45 to 0.6%. Those are the same like windows essentially.
Exactly.
Cool. And I can confirm that you do not want to have a 0.85 flower because it will grow mold. 100% chance. it will grow mold. So these
So
numbers
funny
are important.
story. When we tried to do this calibration, I got the bright idea that we should calibrate, as high as possible. So I was like, oh, let's calibrate to, zero point 0.9. No.
I've also had similar ideas and also been humbled by fungi. So
So
yeah.
it's like I put it in the salt chamber for 24 hours and I looked at it and I was like, I'm not pulling this out of the salt chamber. It and the salt chamber is going into an autoclave and then going to,
Yeah.
waste
Yeah.
because
That's their salt chamber now.
yeah,
That's
I
not our
don't.
salt chamber.
The salt chamber no longer exists. It can go with the samples because I don't know what we grew.
But pretty amazing that we have figured out like those sweet spots that a sample won't mold. Like it really is a science that if you do dry and cure correctly, you're going to have this stable, flavorful product that is not going to grow mold or bacteria, and it's going to be stable on a shelf. So like as you're talking about this research with safety, like it is so important. And I think especially when you see a moldy nug, you're like, yeah, this is important to research because that's actually pretty easy to do if you have residual water of any sort in that sample. So it's important and it's a little scary.
When I do tours through our facility, that's when I talk about water activity, that's one of the ways I explain it is, a lot of times, so Florida requires final product packaging. And so a lot of times what's happening is product is getting packaged and sent to the lab within, 24 to 48 hours of it being completely packaged. And then the lab is testing that sample out, within the hold time for water activity is 72 hours. So the lab is running water activity within 72 hours of receiving that product. But then by the time the final COA is issued, everything is put through the systems, it makes its way to the dispensaries, and someone buys it. It could be 4 to 6 weeks before someone purchases that flower. And so, the worst thing you would ever want is when the lab tests it not to have yeast and mold, but it had a high water activity. So then when the consumer opens that package, it's full of mold. And so that's why that water activity is so important, because then if when the lab is testing it at the time of receiving, and it doesn't have yeast and mold, it shouldn't have yeast and mold once the consumer buys it if you're in that sweet spot range for water activity.
Gotcha. Is it an issue in Florida with having such like high humidity that people's cannabis molds at home?
I think if you open it and you leave it out,
Yeah.
a lot of times. So, in Florida, I do think we see a lot of times drier flower sometimes because of the humidity issues and battling things like mold.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So sometimes I think a consumer might think it's a good idea to like open it and put it out on their back porch and like let it reabsorb some humidity. Much better option would be to use a Bovita pack that can add the correct amount safely.
They really work. I know they get a lot of shit online, but really they're exactly what you're describing. It's like a saline pack that adds moisture back into your product at a specific amount. Like, and I know a lot of people think it like steals terps, but if you really think of it as simple as it is, as just a saline pack, it's not destroying your terps. It's really just creating like a protective coating around your trichomes and allowing your terps to stay in your product. I love that. This is not a paid ad. I really enjoy using the Bovita packs, especially if you do get really dry flower from a dispensary and you want to rehydrate it, give it a little more life.
Right. So I think the way people store in Florida can definitely impact. So, you may buy product that has a safe water activity and doesn't have mold, but if you don't store it properly in Florida with the humidity, if you're not storing it in an airtight container, you are going to risk, mold growing on it the longer you leave it, just because, it's 90% humidity outside. I mean, you walk outside and you're swimming, like you said.
Yeah. How has it been working in the cannabis industry in Florida? I feel like Florida's always on the news for something. I'm just kind of curious because I've heard it's just kind of like the Wild West or Wild South down there. So what's it been like on your end?
It's definitely been a lot of development over the years. So when the market first came about in 2018 and they passed medical cannabis in Florida, there was no testing regs. So people didn't have to test product. They could choose to, and a lot of the, initial producers were testing for safety, but some of the other producers may not have been testing for safety. And so it wasn't a requirement, which is why emergency rules got issued in 2020 that required testing and required specific testing. Were those emergency rules perfect? No. But were they something? Yes. And that's what we needed. And so I think that that's where, really the turning point in the industry happened. And ever since then, things have been moving in the right direction. But Florida is still facing the same battles we see on the news for other states. We're facing, the THC inflation. We're facing, incorrect identification of contaminants. We're facing, in Florida, you're also facing an oversaturation of labs because of it being a vertically integrated system. When you have, right now, there's about 25 producers, I believe, is the most current updated number, and 20 of those are producing. But of those, you're talking about probably 10 producing at a substantial amount, and there's 9 testing labs. So right now it is, there used to be 11 testing labs. So 2 testing labs have closed. So I think that, in Florida right now, we're supposed to be issuing an additional, 22 licenses. I think that will help when those licenses come on board. And then, adult use is on the ballot in November. So if that passes, that's, a game changer for Florida as well for the testing labs. But it is a battle. And if you are a testing lab that is trying to do things correctly, you are going to suffer and you are going to struggle because you're not willing to do those things and compromise ethically. And it sometimes can impact your business.
Is it mostly like a throughput or a cost issue, or is it just that honesty issue? Like, is it that the quality labs they're just not able to get things through the lab that much, or just that you're not willing to compromise your integrity for lying about a number?
The second.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
yeah.
I mean, our average turnaround time is, about 3 days. So, wow. And that's because, you have to incubate total yeast and mold for 72 hours. But those samples are incubated immediately when they arrive, and removed at the 72-hour point and immediately counted and reviewed, and we're issuing reports that day. So that's really where our bottleneck would be when it comes to final product compliance. But aside from that, all of our other analyses, we have plenty of instrumentation to be able to handle high throughput. It's that, 72 hours is where our kind of line is because of the incubation for total yeast and mold testing.
Yeah, and like 72 hours is fast, I think. Like I've submitted samples to testing labs and not heard back for like a week and a half. So I feel like that's fire. So, I mean, keep the integrity up. I think I'm hoping as the industry matures, we're going to see the labs doing the right things start to, really rise to the top. And some of these more sketchy labs, maybe they go out of business, or maybe they just keep collaborating with sketchy brands. Last few questions before we end this. Where do you think that we need more research in the industry, whether that be the testing lab component or medical patients or other? Like, where would you like to see the next big research study happening, whether it's you or someone else?
Next big research study I would like to see, and this definitely wouldn't involve me, it would involve, clinical aspects, would be understanding, the intoxicating synthetic cannabinoids, and understanding the clinical impacts of that. Because I think that there's this, understanding, I could go to the hemp market and get these products, so we don't need a legal cannabis market. And I worry about the safety of those products. We've tested some hemp products that have these synthetic cannabinoids that have all of these really strange peaks on a chromatogram that we can't identify. And so that's concerns clinically for people. Like, what are we putting, what other things are being formed? What about the acids that are being used to create these synthetics? Are we getting rid of them completely? That's not something testing labs are testing for. So I think that's really where the research needs to focus next, is those synthetic intoxicating cannabinoids, to really help consumers understand why a legal cannabis market is so important and why they need to be utilizing the legal cannabis market.
I love this topic. And for anyone who doesn't know, I'm talking about products like Delta 8 THC, HHC, Delta 10 THC, any of these synthetic isomers, essentially, that are being created and sold legally on the hemp market. And I am a huge proponent for hemp. So when I'm talking about hemp, I'm not talking about these synthetic molecules. And something that bothers me, and I've been super vocal about this, is I don't think a lot of consumers know that these products are synthetically made. And I think that's really messed up, that we are marketing and selling these hemp cannabis products, which people automatically assume are natural when you hear hemp and cannabis. They don't know that that product was made in a lab by subjecting it to crazy amounts of heat and acid and producing these zombie molecules that we have zero data in the human body. Whereas, like, it frustrates me so much because we've created this dangerous hemp industry with these unknown products, but at the same time we're heavily limiting the access to the natural product. So like our government has successfully made a dangerous and illicit product type more available than a safe and effective natural product. And yeah, that just like, it's so backwards to me. And I don't know, I have a lot of friends who own hemp companies too. And I understand that they're just trying to make their bottom line. But as you're saying, like, if you look at a chromatogram of a natural hemp flower and you look at all these different peaks, you know that those peaks were made by the plant and that people have been consuming all of those compounds for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? Then you look at the chromatogram of what you're talking about, of these synthetically made products, which theoretically should have one peak. It should be a pure compound if you're marketing it as HHC or Delta 8 THC. But it's not one peak. It's 50 peaks. And we know nothing about those 50 peaks or what they do in the body or any potential toxicity. We know nothing about it, So like an unknown in a synthetic product is very different than an unknown and a natural product, because there's tons of unknowns in natural products. If you drink tea at night and you were to run that through a chromatogram or a HPLC, you wouldn't understand half of the peaks on that either. But the tea still makes you feel good, and people have still been consuming that tea for so long that you're not worried about it. Mm-hmm. So there's like so many more layers to this that I think the most frustrating part is the lack of transparency to the consumers, and the consumers are really the ones who are losing here. Not anyone else.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where we work with some hemp companies, but the hemp companies we are working with are the ones who do care and who want those real numbers and want to understand what they're making and if there's weird peaks or if they have, formed byproducts of any type. And I think that's where we need to be going, because in the hemp market, there's definitely a space in the industry for hemp, but these synthetically made intoxicating cannabinoids are scary. Like, plain and simple, they're scary. Until we can understand them, there's so much unknown with them. And we see constantly in the news about people getting sick from these types of products. And so it's like, why are they getting sick? Because there's contaminants that aren't being tested because the market is so loosely regulated? Or is it some of these synthetic compounds that they formed? Or is it byproducts that were formed? Or is it acid that's left over? There's so many questions surrounding these synthetics. And I think that that's where a lot of this research needs to be focused, so that we can help people understand, the true hemp market and the true legal cannabis market, and why those markets are important, and why we need to, kind of move away from these, synthetic intoxicating cannabinoids.
Yeah, and I will attach a paper, I'm sure you've read it, by the Journal of Natural Products that did look at a Delta 8, maybe a couple Delta 8 products. If you haven't read it, I'll send it to you too. But they identified quite a few of these mystery cannabinoid peaks in the chromatogram, and essentially were saying, yo, don't be taking these products. We don't know what any of this is. And I actually posted a video of that to like TikTok. And a lot of people are like, what do you mean? Like, it looks so similar to THC. And I'm like, bro, we can't gauge molecule safety by what they look like. Like, that is not how we science. So I'll attach that in the show notes if anyone wants to read it. But I think it's a really good paper. But I want to thank you for taking the time, coming on the podcast, and discussing the awesome research that you've been doing in such an open way. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I've learned a lot, and I'm really hoping that the listeners learned a lot too. If you could just kind of say where to find you, if you want people to contact you, how to contact you, and anything else you got in the pipeline that you want to share, the floor is all yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. I'm very passionate about moisture and water activity, so it's something that I was really excited to be able to share with everybody. If you want to get in contact with me, you can find me on LinkedIn, Jini Glaros, and you can reach out to me there. I'm happy to chat more about these two things. You can also find some different presentations on moisture and water activity that are published on my LinkedIn. So if you want to learn more about what we've talked about there, you can also visit that. And looking forward to the publication being ready. That is something I will definitely post on LinkedIn when it becomes available. And then also be on the lookout for my recently approved publication through ASTM's Journal of Testing and Evaluation, focused on agricultural agents and the proper quantification of those in cannabis, utilizing matrix calibrations for LCMS-MS.
Very, very cool. Yeah, I'll link your LinkedIn in the show notes of this episode so people can find you there. Last question, is Jini with a J, is that your full name or is that short for something?
Nope, that's my full name.
Wow, I've never heard that before. I really like it. Yeah, I always assumed it was abbreviated of something, but that's cool. I've seen Jini with a G, but not with a J. So
yeah, my dad wanted to name me Virginia and my mom did not, so they compromised with Jini, J-I-N-I.
I love that. So cool. Okay, well, thank you all for listening. Jini, thank you for being on the podcast. It's been awesome, and mad love. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks.